Hello. Today we're going to go over the new purchase agreement that we have for Homestar. You're welcome to use the Ohio Board of Realtors purchase agreement if you like, but we also have this one now available for anyone to use. It's a little bit shorter and easier to read. At the top, you're going to add all of your buyers' names, including any LLCs, incorporations, power of attorneys, trusts, and so on. So the buyer's name that you represent needs to have buyer's name. We'll say Betty Buyer, comma, CEO of ABC LLC. That's how their name would be written, and that's how they're going to sign. The property address, the next section, you're going to put the complete property address on here. Line number 1 can have the address numbers and the street name, and then the city and the state and the zip code will be listed on the second line. Permanent parcel number is going to be found on the MLS or with the county auditor, and you want to add all the parcel ID numbers there. The next paragraph talks about what is going to be included with the property, and it does state that the buyer accepts this property as is present physical condition, meaning that they are putting this offer in based on what they see when they're walking through. That doesn't mean that they can't ask for things to be corrected after the inspection, and we'll get to that later. So what is included? Anything that is attached to the property. So if you basically take that property and flip it upside down, whatever is stuck there attached to the property, that's what's included. There also is a section there where you can include appliances, and those appliances are going to be listed on your MLS, so you know what's going to be included. Perhaps you are walking through there with your buyer and they see a Samsung washer and dryer and they get all excited in the utility room. Oh my God, I'm going to get a new one. That would be great. But maybe they don't have those listed on the MLS sheet. As long as it is not noted on the MLS that item does not convey with the property or does not transfer with the property, the buyer can ask for them. It'll be up to the seller to say no at that point. So that would be listed on the any additional appliances section there included. If it did say that it's not going to convey, then it's going to be listed on the second line there. The next section says this is or is not a secondary offer. If it is a secondary offer, you're going to put a deadline on there so the buyer is not locked into this forever. But most of your properties are going to not be a secondary offer, so you're just going to pick the no is not. The price the buyer shall pay the sum of, so that's the purchase price. So how much do they want to offer on the property based on your comparables for sold like for like properties there. Earnest money is always going to be paid to the title company, and it's around 1% of the purchase price. So for instance, if you have a $250,000 property, it could be $1,500, $2,000, $1,000, $2,500. It's not an exact number. It's just whatever the buyer is comfortable allowing the title company to hold. That money has to be ready, available, and they do need to put it with the title company within 3 days of this signed agreement. That is your responsibility to make sure that they get that done. If you have any questions about earnest money, please give us a call. Funds deposited in escrow is going to be the down payment money for their loan. So how much are they going to put down on their loan? 3.5%, 20%, or a specific dollar amount? Or maybe it's going to be per lender because they don't know yet. That's totally fine. But to get the mortgage loan to be attained by the buyer number, you're subtracting the down payment from the purchase price, and that's how much the loan would be. So if you know that number, these are all going to be basic numbers. The lender is going to finalize everything once they get through the loan process. The The next section is going to be, how are they going to pay for it? Conventional, FHA, VA, or other. VA could be hard money. It could also be cash. And if it is cash, then there may or may not be a down payment with that. But you always want to have earnest money because that is showing that your buyer really wants to purchase the property. The financing section is telling the seller and the listing agent, when is the buyer going to make their application with their loan officer? And they want to see as soon as possible. So I have 3 to 5 days there. You could put that in there if you want to. You could just put 5 days. You could just put 3 days if you want, but no later than 7 days, because 7 days is too long. The seller's going to want to know why there's a delay with them reaching out to their loan officer, right? So as soon as possible. And then it says, when are they going to get that clear to close, which is listed on here as loan commitment, but we know that's clear to close. And it's going to depend on the mortgage product, right? So if it's conventional, it could be 30 days. If it's FHA, VA, USDA, could be 45 days. And if it's cash, this does not even apply, right? The buyer settlement charges section is where the buyer is asking the seller to contribute money towards their closing costs. This is not commission. This is just their closing costs, their lender fees, their title fees, their prepaids. What's a prepay, right? I have to pay for my general home inspection at the time of. I have to pay for the appraisal before we're done, right? Those are prepaids. Well, you can use some of this money to, in essence, get paid back as a buyer because it'll be less money they have to bring to the table at that time. So help with their fees. It could be a specific dollar amount like $5,000, or it could be a percentage. I have 5,000 or 6%. 6% is pretty much the max that anybody could ask for. And that is going to depend on the loan product. So if you don't know about closing costs and how much your buyer can ask for, the number one answer to that is ask their loan officer. But there's also information in your onboarding from me about those as well. So you can always reach out to us. The closing date and the transfer date are going to depend upon the loan product, right? So depending on what kind of loan they're doing, if they're doing a conventional, like I said, it could take 30 days to get through the process. You're going to put that 30-day closing date in this section here. The title shall be recorded on or about. That's going to be your transfer date, and that's going to depend on when you're closing. Normally, we want to put either the same day as the closing or the day after, and these are dates on here. So February 1st, February 2nd, that type of thing. There's also a little disclaimer in here about title companies not accepting more than $10,000 on a check. Anything over that has to be electronically transferred to the title company. There is also a little disclaimer on here that says if there's something going on that's not either the buyer or the seller's control, then you could extend the period for like 7 days or so. So it really gives you an on or about number here in this paragraph. And if you are going to extend your closing date, then you probably should have a purchase agreement addendum so that the buyer and the seller all agree to that extra day there, the extra days in there. Possession is going to be when is the buyer going to get the keys, right? So the seller is going to deliver the keys to the buyer, and that would be the listing agent to you within so many days of the title being recorded. Now, a lot of times people will ask for it at the keys at the closing table. And that's fine too. If you get them at the closing table, that's great. They might give you the keys at the closing table and tell you, please don't give them to the buyer until Saturday at 9 a.m. or something like that. So it's all agreed upon times. At this time, when you're putting your offer in, you're just going to put at the time of transfer. If the buyer is going to allow the seller to stay on the property for an extra day or two, you could put the days there in this section here. If they want to stay for an additional week, you could put 7 days here and then at a rate of something per day. Your per day rate is going to be something that is like a normal per day rate. And how you would figure that out is you would divide your loan payment by 30. That would give you a per day rate, or basic market rent for a particular house like that, and divide that by 30. That's also going to give you a per day rate. But the buyer cannot gouge the seller at this point, okay? If they're going to stay longer than a week or even 2 at the most, I would have them do the post possession addendum, because it's like a mini lease agreement, okay? The section for title is basically the title company is going to come in and they're going to remove all the seller's liens, all the people that are listed on their title, all the mortgages, anything that is not supposed to convey to the buyer. So things that could be an exception on the title would be things like encumbrances or easements, things that run with the land zoning ordinances, and of course your taxes. Okay, so the title company is going to remove all of that stuff so that when the buyer does take possession, it's just going to have their name and their mortgage, if they're doing one, as a lien, and then any people that they are also including in the title on there. The next section says who is doing the closing services. So that's the title company. So on our new purchase agreement, you can check mark Ohio Real Title or Emerald Glen Title, as those are our preferred title companies, or there is a section for other. Maybe you don't want to use Emerald Glen or Ohio Real Title and you want to use Infinity Title. It is entirely up to your buyer who they want to choose, and you can write another one on here. If you are going to use Ohio Real Title or Emerald Glen Title, please talk to the office about the affiliated business arrangement disclosure that would have to be signed. The proration section talks about taxes and other things that might be prorated, like your homeowners association fees might be prorated, but generally it's the taxes. So this is telling the buyer that your taxes are going to be paid current up to the day of closing by the seller. So anything that they owed previously, all the way up to the day of your closing, is going to be taken care of by the seller. And then the buyer's responsibility is going to be from the day of closing forward. So sometimes the taxes might look a little different, especially if they're doing cash, to that buyer when they get their next bill, because it's going to depend on what time of year those taxes are paid, how it's going to look going forward. When you're doing a loan, your lender is going to escrow the taxes and insurance into the payment for the buyer. So generally, their payments are all going to stay the same, and they just figure out all of the ins and outs of the taxes and their prorations and stuff on the back end. But people who are paying cash, those are the ones that usually see the difference there. Charges and escrow instructions. This is where the seller is going to agree to pay for half of the closing costs for the escrow, half of the deed prep, half of the real estate transfer tax, any amount to discharge their mortgage or lien or encumbrance, the title exam, half of insuring the owner's and fee policy, prorations due to the buyer. So the buyer gets some extra help here over and above their closing costs help in the beginning. if they so choose to. Okay, it is pretty customary in the state of Ohio for the seller to pay for half of those escrow fee and half of the new owner's fee policy. They're also going to provide tenant security deposits in the way of a credit on the HUD settlement statement. So if you have a buyer who is going to buy a property that has a tenant already situated in it, the settlement statement will show, oh, let's see, maybe $2,000 of credit there because you have 2 apartments in a multifamily property, right? That's $1,000 each. The buyer's not going to get $1,000 each in cash, but they're going to get a credit on their settlement statement so that in essence, when that tenant does leave the following year, they can give them their security deposit back. The buyer's broker compensation has been added to this purchase agreement. So it's listed right here and right underneath the title section there because they need to read that. So this says the buyer and the seller acknowledge that commissions are not set by law, are fully negotiable, and the parties involved are going to be paying on behalf of the buyer to the buyer's broker, which is listed on this purchase agreement as Century 21 Homestar. If you're just doing Homestar Network, it'll just say Homestar Network on that one. Sellers agree to pay whatever they're going to agree to pay, 3% or whatever is agreed upon. And the buyers, you're going to have at least your $350 minimum fee there. So you got to have your office fee listed on here. If you recall, it's going to be on your buyer agency agreement. It also has to be listed on here. If your seller is not going to pay all 3% that you ask for, and they're only going to pay 1%, this might be negotiated at the time of your offer. But to always make sure you have your $350 minimum on your buyer broker compensation agreement in the buyer's section, unless you are paying for it for your buyer. It also says that the buyer broker cannot accept more compensation from any source that exceeds the amount agreed upon in the agreement with the buyer. That's your buyer agency agreement. If you do not have an amount on your buyer agency agreement, you're basically stating that we're not going to be paid. So always remember to put the max on your buyer agency agreement. If you need help with that, please contact me or Tony will help you with that. The home warranty section is just allowing the buyer to either request a home warranty or not request a home warranty. If you have a home warranty listed on the MLS, then you're going to put yes, they are, and how much it is. Maybe the seller doesn't have one listed on the MLS, but the buyer wants one. They can ask for one. You just mark does, how much is the cost of it, and who's the home warranty company. I have America's Preferred Home Warranty Company listed here. Their basic package is about $499. We always want to make sure that they get a home warranty and the home inspection. Okay, so the next section is talking about the inspection. And you really want to recommend to your buyers that they get at least a general home inspection so that they know what is going on with their property. If for some reason they decide they don't want any of the inspections listed on page number 5, not only are they going to initial they're going to initial this waiver section for anything that is a no. So if they don't want the septic, the well, the radon, the mold, the pests, they're going to initial up there to include those, but they want the general home. You just mark that and then you put how many days is it going to take for you to get to the inspection scheduled and who's going to pay for it. If they don't want the general home inspection, you are going to have them sign an additional document that is called a buyer's waiver of inspection that protects you and the office from any backlash for that. So because we really want them to get the general home inspection. Please contact me or Tony if you have any questions about that. On this line underneath the pass, any inspection suggested by the inspector is something that I have written on there because that's going to cover you to go back and get the septic inspected or the well inspected or mold inspected or pest inspected. If they find something, maybe they find structural damage, right? That's not something that you or I would be able to notice with the naked eye, but an inspector is trained to look at that stuff. That would give you extra days to get the structural engineer out there. Always remember, and I have this highlighted, that you have to acknowledge to the listing agent and the seller within 3 days of completion of that inspection an answer on whether they want to remove the inspection contingency and move on with the deal, whether they want to get a mutual release and get out of the deal and get their earnest money back because there's too much going on with the house, or whether you need additional inspections done, like that's structural engineer coming out and so on, that gives you more time, or whether you're going to ask for things to be remedied. So asking for a request to remedy. If you are asking for a request to remedy, you're asking for the contract to be changed. So all parties have to agree to those requests. If it is not a written agreement and it's only verbal, you and the listing agent talking, this is not legal and binding. If you and the listing agent are just talking or you're talking over text and things like that, that is not the buyer and the seller signing off on things. That is just you guys negotiating. So make sure you get everything written out and the buyer and the seller both agree. If for some reason the buyer decides to get out of the deal and they're asking for their earnest money back, the seller does have the option to ask for that inspection report because maybe they don't believe it, right? At that time, the buyer will allow you to give a copy of that report to the listing agent and the seller. Otherwise, that report is owned by the buyer and it stays with us. It does not go to the other side unless they ask for it. When you're asking for remedies, though, you can snip out the little sections in the report and add them to your addendum so that they can see specifically what you're asking for. Megan's Law. So Megan's Law is your sex offender registry. I just want to caution everyone and let them know that you can tell your buyer if they are worried about sex offenders in the area to contact the local sheriff's department or to go on line and see. Okay, you're not to discuss this at all because it might not be accurate or someone may have given you the wrong information. So you don't want to be giving anything out there that you don't know for sure. So they can contact their local sheriff's department. That's going to be their best bet there. Condition of the property. The buyer has examined the property and agrees that the property is being purchased as is, like we were talking about before, right? Its present physical condition, including any defects disclosed by the seller on the property disclosure. So this is basically saying that the seller is going to answer all the questions on the property disclosure and let the buyer know what they know. Did you get the property disclosure form or did you not as a buyer? So they're going to mark either they did or they did not. There's also a disclosure there about the seller shall pay all costs for any repairs of any gas leak found between the street and the foundation at the time of the recording of the title. Or the restoration of utilities, whichever is sooner. This is really important. We did add this in here because we've had a lot of conflict about this. So it is the seller's responsibility to make sure that's corrected if that in case happens with you. Always contact the office for further questions about that. Representations and disclaimers. So this is basically saying that, you know, we are only going to tell you what we know about the property as a buyer agent, right? So whatever the listing agent or the seller tells us, or whatever public data tells us and things like that, if we don't know, we can't really tell you. Okay, so we're not going to be going into the crawl space and doing anything like that. We're not going to be commenting about any of that stuff or whatever. You need to talk to the professionals. If you have any questions about heating or any questions about plumbing or roofs or any of that stuff, you need to talk to somebody who that's their realm of expertise there. Any damage that is done to the property during this escrow period in time that happens because of the inspections or things that are getting repaired and fixed there is going to be the responsibility of the buyer to make sure that they get that all done. If something happens and the property is catches on fire or a tree falls on it or something like that during the time, the buyer does not have to keep in this contract. They can always get out and get a mutual release signed if it's something like that. Seller's cooperation. So this is telling the sellers that they need to make sure that the property is available and accessible by inspectors, by appraisers, by people that are helping other professionals that would be fixing things and stuff like that. It also says that the utilities should be on during this time and that so that they can be inspected or tested by the professionals there. And that includes your inspector and your appraiser, because they're both going to try and do those things, okay? Debris and personal property, this is telling the seller that they need to make sure that the property is in broom swept clean condition when they leave. They're going to remove all of the debris and personal property from the house so that the buyer can move into a blank slate, so to speak, right? If for some reason they don't do that and the buyer has to get some kind of a removal for all of their things and stuff like that, they can go back on the seller and have them pay for that. And if they can reach them. Any addendums that are going to be included with this purchase agreement should be marked here. So what are those? That's your agency disclosure, right? Your property disclosure, your lead-based paint, and affiliated business arrangement disclosure if you're using Ohio Real Title or such. Any condominium, VA, or FHA addendums. The walkthrough addendum you definitely want to have, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. And anything else, a home sale contingency addendum, and so on. Earnest money. So this section right here, you can read to your buyers because this explains how earnest money is taken care of with a deal. Okay, you can't just call up the title company and say, hey, the deal's dead, send the earnest money back to the buyer. That's not how this works. There has to be a clear written paper trail. So how does earnest money get dispersed? With a closed deal, it's going to be less money that the buyer has to bring to the table because it covers some of their cost. With a mutual release signed by the buyer and the seller stating who gets the earnest money. So whether the buyer wants to back out and they're eligible to get their earnest money, or maybe the seller says, no, I want that earnest money because you wasted my time for 6 weeks. Okay, they're fighting over the earnest money at that point. So either they agree and they both sign it, and then the seller or the title company has a clear idea of who's supposed to have it, or it's still going to sit there. They can go fight that out then in front of a judge. So they can take it to small claims court and the judge will decide who will get the earnest money. If none of those things happen, the money sits in the escrow account for 2 years and then it gets dispersed back to the buyer. This is not new. You should have learned all of this in your schooling and such, but it is a reminder. We cannot practice law and be talking about earnest money to our buyers or our sellers for that matter. You can read this paragraph to your buyer. And you can also say revert back to your purchase agreement in the earnest money section if they have any questions about their earnest money. They can also contact an attorney if they have any questions. Of course, the buyers are going to be initialing all the bottoms of these pages. This is a legal binding agreement once everyone has signed it, and it will be in full force and effect. Additional terms. So here's where you would put the disclosure of the buyer is a licensed real estate agent. Maybe you're representing a family member, so the buyer agent is related to the buyer. Maybe you have a partner, and so you're buying and you have a financial interest as an into the property. Maybe you're not, maybe your spouse has a partner. You still have a financial interest in the property, so you have to disclose that you are related to or has a financial interest in. You don't have to say what the relation is, and you don't have to say what the financial interest is, but you got to disclose it for people to know. There might be other special terms that you need to include for whatever reason, and those could also be listed here. When you get to the signature section, when you're representing the client, you want to make sure that all of their signatures match their printed name. So if it's Betty Buyer and she's buying for an LLC, you are going to be writing, they're going to be signing Betty Buyer for ABC LLC, Betty Buyer CEO of ABC LLC, and so on. The printed name will also match the signature. And then it's always great if you give us their contact information. If you have more than one buyer, you've got a couple different spots there for the buyers to all sign. Underneath that, you're going to have where the sellers are going to sign. This is the same, should be the same as the buyers. If we represent the sellers, we want them to all be signing appropriately. If you happen to notice when you get your offer back that someone signed Main Street LLC and they didn't put a person's name there, you can ask them for the person's name so that you know if they don't have it printed on there. But we can't ask them really, we can't police what other people do, right? We just need to make sure that our stuff is going to be correct. Underneath that, you're going to have who is the buyer agent in their company and who is the listing agent in their company. You, as the buyer agent, fills out this whole section. Please answer every single question on here. Name, company, phone number, email, license number for the seller agent and the buyer agent. You can find the listing agent's information on the MLS. And there you go. That is your basic new purchase agreement. So as you can see, there's some language that's been added in here, so you don't need those additional addendums, but then there's always addendums that you do want to include, like your walkthrough addendum, for instance. You always want to make sure you have that because that protects you as a buyer agent. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm always available for you guys and happy to talk. Have a great day.